Park Association with some help from the Prospect Park Anti-Racist Organization, which is an informal group of neighbors that fosters conversation and action on anti-racism in Prospect Park. And if someone from PPA wants to throw the link to the Prospect Park Association website, go for it. As I mentioned, this workshop series is sponsored by the Prospect Park Neighborhood Association. PPA's mission is to promote in a nonpartisan, educational, and cooperative manner the health, safety, and general welfare of the neighborhood, and to promote the maintenance and improvement of the aesthetic, residential, and physical qualities of the neighborhood environment. 2020 opened the door to new possibilities in terms of public safety, and 2021 presents us with the opportunity to step through it. The killing of George Floyd and our ongoing reckoning with longstanding racism has forced Minneapolis to answer difficult questions. Who keeps us safe? What role should the police play in public safety? What does it mean to be safe in the first place? In this workshop series, we'll be exploring these questions and others, guided by presentations from local community organizers, activists, and advocates. After their presentation, we'll do a brief question and answer before breaking out into small groups for some facilitated discussions. At the end, we'll regroup for a final round of discussion and question and answer. And I can tell you from doing this last week, it was really, really nice to meet some new neighbors. I don't know about you, but I haven't made a lot of new friends since COVID started. So it was really fun just to meet some new people. Before we go any further, we're going to set up some group norms for the evening. So those should be appearing on the screen in a second. Cool. So the first one is one mic, one voice. We just ask that only one person is speaking at a time. If you do have questions for the presenter, feel free to put those in the chat box. Madeline is monitoring the chat today, and she will ask your questions to the presenters. If you don't want to type out like a whole question, but you would rather say your own, you can either just type Q if you want to be really quick and say like Q for question, or you can say I have a question, whatever is easy and fast for you. We ask that you step up and step back. Be aware of how much you're speaking, especially in our breakout groups. Use I statements, speak from your own experience. Put relationships first. Work to build community and trust with an awareness of power dynamics. We ask that among neighbors, we assume best intentions only. Assume that people are speaking with best intentions, but don't assume anything else about their experiences. If you do challenge an idea, make sure that you're challenging the idea and not the person. If someone says something that's incorrect or offensive, call them out on it politely. And then, as we'll all do tonight, lean into discomfort. Be willing to experience some discomfort during discussions and to learn from it. Please note that if you are violating these norms, we may send you a warning or mute you, and hopefully this won't happen. I don't think that it will. We might ask you to leave the group just because we want this workshop to be a safe and respectful space for everyone involved. All right, so without further ado, let's get started. Today, joining us, we have Erin, Sikkink, and April Graves from the Minneapolis Office of Violence Prevention. And I think that's all I have by way of introduction. If you two want to share your screen and take it away. Thank you for being with us tonight, for real.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenna. Are you able to see my screen now?
Looks good.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for having us. As Jenna mentioned, my name is Erin Sikkink. I'm with the City of Minneapolis Health Department and in the Office of Violence Prevention. So April did let me know, she was in here earlier, Jenna, and she got kicked out. She's trying to get back in. So if you could just admit her when you see her pop up, that would be awesome. So again, thank you so much. Oh, forgot to mention, I use she, her pronouns. My colleague, April Graves, who will be hopefully joining us soon, also uses she, her pronouns. And we're very happy tonight to be able to speak to you about our work in the Office of Violence Prevention. As mentioned, please feel free to put your questions in the chat, and happy to answer those as we go along or to wait for the end. A quick acknowledgement just before we get into the meat of the presentation. we just want to make sure that we acknowledge that violence prevention work can be painful, that violence may have happened to you or to someone that you love. Violence can take many forms. It could be an unkind word, a physical assault, an unjust policy, a discriminatory system. So even talking about violence sometimes can be re-traumatizing for those who have experienced it. And whether you're a witness, survivor, perpetrator, or a healer, it takes all of us to prevent and heal from past violence. So that being said, just please make sure that you take care of yourself and honor yourself as needed throughout this presentation. And as we're speaking about violence. And I think, April, you were able to get on, is that correct?
Yeah, Erin, I'm here. Can you all hear me?
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
going to keep my camera off in the hopes that that makes my internet service work better.
Perfect. Well, perfect timing. Hopefully you can see the slides, and I'm going to turn it over to you to get things started.
Hey, Erin, there was a request to go into presentation mode with a PowerPoint. Are you able to do that? Right now we can see like the side panel.
Oh, yeah.
Just to help with visibility. That should be awesome.
Okay.
I think that's presenter mode, but so we can see what's coming up next, but that's okay. And any notes you have, but it's a little bigger.
Oh. Does this, okay. Well, let me have April get started and I'll see if I can make it better as we go.
Sure. So first we're going to just talk about what the public health approach to violence is. And really the approach is that we look at violence as if it's really any other kind of communicable disease, that it can spread, but it also can be prevented and cured and treated. So that's how we look at violence. It's not inevitable. It's not inevitable. It can be prevented and it can be spread, and it can also be treated and cured. There you go, Erin. That looks great.
Okay, now I'm just having a hard time advancing to the next slide. So let me just, there we go.
There, all right. So continuing to just talk about what the public health approach to violence prevention is. This tells you a little bit more about how we actually move through that approach in a systemic and scientific way. So the first step is always to sort of define what the problem is. The next step would be sort of to identify what the different risk and protective factors are specific to that problem, which we'll talk a little bit more about risk and protective factors in a moment. From there, we develop and test preventative strategies. And so there's lots of different evidence-based strategies that have been used in other communities that we can use to see how it would work with our community, as well as create our own and then test the outcomes of those. And then once we do find some that are really effective, we can assure widespread adoption. So those are sort of the 4 steps to the public health approach. So speaking about risk and protective factors, risk factors are likely to increase the likelihood that a person will experience harm or engage in violence. And it's similar to sort of, if you guys are familiar at all with adverse childhood experiences or ACEs, there's some parallels there. So a couple of the examples that we have of risk factors are exposure to violence and conflict in your family, high levels of transiency, diminished economic opportunities, involvement with drugs, alcohol, or tobacco, low parental involvement, or low commitment to school and school failure. And those are just some examples. Protective factors, on the other hand, can decrease the potential for harmful effects of those risk factors that we just stated, and reduce the likelihood that someone will engage in violence. So some positive protective factors are connectedness to family or adults outside the family. Oftentimes you'll hear that referred to as connection to a caring adult in some of the different approaches that we've used. Another protective factors could be involvement in social activities, commitment to school, skills for realistic planning, parental and family use of constructive strategies for coping with problems. Yeah, next slide, Erin. And I just want to, say that any one person could have one or many of these risk or protective factors, but the presence of a risk factor does not automatically mean that someone will behave violently or experience violence. And the presence of a protective factor does not necessarily mean that someone will automatically be protected against experiencing violence or behaving violently. So even those things might give us a bit of a clue as to what issues might be present sort of at the root of the violence and ways that we can mitigate that. It doesn't necessarily mean that's automatic at all. And we want to make sure that we're not assuming that just because somebody has risk factors in their life that automatically means that they will be violent or will have violence happen against them.
So next, we just want to touch on this, what we're calling the prevention continuum, sometimes in public health also referred to as the public health pyramid or the prevention pyramid. Basically, we are trying to come up with solutions to prevent violence based on 3 different levels. So upfront, in the thick, and then aftermath, or sometimes also known as primary, secondary, or tertiary prevention. So approaches that take place before violence has occurred are considered primary prevention efforts, and they help lay the groundwork to prevent violence from emerging. So if you were to think of violence as a disease, for instance, a good example of a primary prevention method would be a vaccination, something that we're probably all thinking a lot about these days. So a vaccine can help prevent a disease before it occurs. So we come up with initiatives to prevent violence before it ever happens. Next, we have in the thick or secondary prevention, where we are trying to intervene early, often at the first sign of violence or at when someone may be at risk to a response in the immediate threat of violence. And then in the aftermath, which is the tertiary prevention level, that could be responding after violence has occurred, helping people deal with the consequences and help to promote healing and restoration, and then also to help prevent recidivism, so help prevent a violent incident from occurring again. This is just a really brief timeline of our work within the city. So in 2006, there was a resolution declared through Mayor R.T. Ryback and the City Council at that time that declared youth violence as a public health issue. And in 2008, the city created our strategic plan to prevent youth violence, which we still refer to today. It's called the Blueprint for Action to Prevent Youth Violence. In 2013, we updated the blueprint to continue to make sure that it was relevant. There's 5 goal areas that are under the blueprint that we still have based a lot of our work upon. And also at that time, we joined the National Forum for Youth Violence Prevention, which helps to still provide technical assistance for our work. In 2016, we expanded some of our work when we received a grant from the CDC to work on intersections between teen dating violence and youth violence. And maybe April can talk a little bit about that later. That is one of her primary work areas. And in 2016 and 2017, we expanded our tertiary prevention violence work, as like I sort of mentioned on the last slide. We launched a hospital-based intervention that's called Next Step, and then also our group violence intervention strategy, which we call Project Life. We'll talk more about that in the next couple of slides. And then in 2018, things really changed for us. In the previous years, we had been part of the city's health department under a division that focused on adolescent health and youth development, which is sort of why our focus was primarily on youth violence prevention. And in 2018, this new city ordinance was created to expand our work into our own department, which is now the Office of Violence Prevention. And we are expanding our focus from not just focusing on youth violence prevention anymore, but all forms of violence. And at the end, I'm going to talk a little bit more about sort of what our future looks like. We also, going forward, are going to be updating the city's strategic plan on violence so that it's not just focused on youth violence as well.
Erin, could I just add something briefly?
Yeah.
I just want to say that, some of this, of the sort of evolution of our work, it was a direct result of data that let us know which young people needed more supports. And so I think there was a recognition that youth, typically thought of as like those under 18, definitely can extend up into those mid 20s. And so some of our tertiary level or, the deeper interventions was a result of recognizing that some of the data was showing that we needed to do some additional work with youth that were a little bit older and not still under 18.
Yeah, thank you. And also just wanted to point out, since it's relevant to this group, that in the last few years, we also, under the guidance of Councilmember Cam Gordon, were able to form our Violence Prevention Steering Committee. And that acts as a body of work to help inform the mayor and other city leaders on how to forward our violence prevention work. So the second half of this presentation is going to focus on our some of our initiatives that we implement in the city in our Office of Violence Prevention. We have many initiatives. We're only going to highlight a few here tonight, but we do have a slide that kind of shows more of our initiatives. And this is the slide that shows many more of our initiatives. Up at this top row here, you'll see our blueprint goal area. So these are the goals under the city's strategic plan to that focus on violence prevention. And then in the middle row here, you'll see the primary prevention, secondary prevention, tertiary prevention. And then underneath, you'll see these are our strategies that fall into these different buckets. Where we are able to, different programs that we have that are helping to prevent violence. So April, do you want to highlight any initiatives here that we're not talking about tonight, like maybe coaching boys into men?
Sure. So primarily my work is really in the primary prevention category, although I support the work of my colleagues in some of these other prevention levels. So the CDC grant that we got was really focused on, like Erin said, teen dating violence and youth violence prevention. So the idea was really to address shared risk and protective factors for both teen dating violence and youth violence. And so as part of that grant, I've been working with high schools, primarily on the north side, because we had to pick a project area. And I've been working with coaches and male athletes at North High School, Patrick Henry High School, Edison High School, as well as Cooper Robbinsdale High School. And the Coaching Boys into Men curriculum is really meant to leverage the relationship between the coach and their athletes, as well as the athletes' relationship to the school and the school culture. And so really it's just a discussion once or twice a week, a short discussion of 20 to 30 minutes about healthy relationships. So some of the different lesson sort of titles would be understanding consent, bragging about your sexual reputation, how to communicate boundaries, respect for women and girls, using insulting language, and things like that. But as part of that work, I also have trained the coaches to lead these conversations. And I think in many ways, a lot of the time coaches don't realize that they might be contributing to negative gender stereotypes with just some of the language that they use during, coaching or during games, like, you guys are throwing like girls or things like that. So we talk a lot about gender stereotypes, what it means to act like a man or be a lady, and sort of try to challenge those perceptions. Another component of that CDC grant is the youth outreach and engagement team that we've contracted with through the YCB, or the Youth Coordinating Board. And that aspect has meant that we put some caring adults out in the community. And these outreach workers are from the North Side. They've worked at Patrick Henry. They've worked at Edison and some of the other North Side middle schools. So they already have established relationships with a number of the young people that live in that neighborhood. And what they do is connect young people to the other opportunities in the community, whether that's an after school program or a summer job opportunity or a connection to a mental health organization. But they also just act sort of as sounding boards and caring adults that young people can talk to and interact with at the park, play a game of basketball, get help with homework. And so that's all within that primary prevention level. Although at times it can sort of get a little bit blurred if, like, let's say there was a conflict between students after school on the playground, it's also possible that the outreach team would do some kind of de-escalation in that situation. And that would be a little bit more secondary prevention. So the lines are not always, super, super obvious, but I just want to give you a little bit more context on that. Also within that same primary prevention column is the pop-up parks. And that's really in collaboration with the Minneapolis Parks. They've really run that program for the last several years. And it mainly is just moving around from different parks around the city, providing activities to young people. Sometimes there's music, sometimes there's organized sports, and sometimes there's just like, other things that people can just come and pick up and play with on any given day. So it rotates around the city to different parks. And I think it's been a good partnership. Sometimes we'll have the outreach team go out there and be an additional support for engagement around those pop-up park activities. On the next level, I don't have as much experience, but these are several different programs that primarily are contracted out to other partners that do some of the work. I think Erin could speak a little bit to inspiring youth. And then we'll go deeper, much deeper, or not much deeper, but on a deeper level when we get to tertiary.
Yeah, thanks, April. Just to touch on inspiring youth, it's definitely one of our programs that is trying to intervene at the sign of first risk. So this program, we partner with the community-based organization Tubman, which has an office over here in South Minneapolis. Some of you may be familiar with them. They provide a lot of domestic violence services to the community, and they also have a lot of services available for youth and families. And in this case, their case managers take referrals through sometimes through the juvenile justice system or also through Minneapolis Public Schools. And they refer young people who maybe they can see are maybe at some risk or showing some signs that they might be at risk of either perpetrating or becoming victims of violence. And so they right away get connected with a case manager at Tubman, and they help them to come up with goals that will help them to kind of get things back on track. So a lot of times that could be helping. They also work very closely with the families and help the family get connected with different resources that they may need. But a lot of times that can look like helping young people with getting tutoring services for school, getting their driver's license, getting a job. It's getting connected to training programs that will help them along the way. So oftentimes they are also connecting with the young person just on a personal level, which as April sort of mentioned, helps them get connected with a caring adult. So I'll move on to next step. April's going to talk about that.
So at the tertiary level, or the highest level of prevention, is one of our programs called Next Step. This is a hospital-based intervention program, and the real focus of the program is to connect with victims of violent injury and make sure that they have resources and support. The idea is that it would reduce retaliation, and also the idea will reduce the likelihood that they'll be victims of violence again. And up until this point, we've partnered with both HCMC and North Memorial Hospital for this hospital-based intervention program. So the staff that we've contracted with, one of them you can see in this picture here, his name is Farji. He's pretty amazing. You may have seen him on some news stories or other TV talking about Next Step. Arrive quickly at the hospital to try to provide that immediate bedside support for both the participant of the program or the victim of violence, as well as the families. Then they also offer and provide long-term community-based follow-up for up to a year and even maybe longer at times, for participants who decide they want to further the support. and work to change their lives by stopping the cycle of violence. What we know is that a lot of the time, hospitals see the same victims of violence come back repeatedly. So this program is really with the intention of stopping that cycle. So just some data from Next Step. So far, we've seen that it's had a pretty positive impact on the cycle of violence. As Erin alluded to earlier, I think it was first kind of lifted up and started kind of in 2017, 18. So up until this point, it's served over 400 participants. Oh, since July 2016, so even longer. And during the program's first year, only 3% of the participants returned to HCMC with the same or similar injury. So that speaks really to stopping that cycle of violence. There's some additional data at the bottom. From July 15th, 2016 through December 31st, 2018, 213 received initial bedside intervention from a violence intervention specialist. 72% of those agreed to a post-discharge community-based service. And of those 72%, 79 of those received support and achieved progress towards their goals. So that's some pretty strong data showing that this program has really served to help stop the cycle of violence through this collaboration with the hospitals.
All right, I'm going to talk next a little bit about our group violence intervention strategy, also known as Project Life in Minneapolis. And this is another tertiary prevention intervention that we are offering through the city. And this is targeting those who are members of gangs, or as we more frequently call them in Minneapolis, groups, sometimes also known as cliques. And this is based on a national evidence-based practice called group violence intervention that was developed by John Jay College. We initially received federal funding to implement this strategy here in Minneapolis. And we're grateful that since that grant has ended, that the city has continued to fund this program in the city's general fund budget. So that we're able to continue to implement it. And basically, the strategy is based on data that suggests a relatively small number of individuals actually drive a large amount of violence in cities. And so it's a partnership between community members, social service providers, and law enforcement that are acting together to address the actions of those that are most responsible for driving the serious violence. And many of those often are those that are involved in a gang or a group. And so this approach we work really closely, again, with some amazing individuals who we call credible messengers, often who have personal experience from having lived experience in being involved in gang or group life themselves, and are now working closely with young people who potentially are wanting to take an honorable exit from being involved in a group or gang. And then they, again, provide case management services to those individuals in helping them to be safe. The main goals of the program are for them to be safe, alive, and free. So helping them to be safe, obviously, so that could mean getting them out of an unsafe situation, keeping them alive, and then also keeping them free from incarceration. Just giving some statistics, in 2016, before we implemented GVI in Minneapolis, there were 93 group members involved in non-fatal shootings in Minneapolis. And in 2017, after we had implemented GVI for 1 year, primarily focused on the north side of Minneapolis, that number dropped down to 42. Next year in 2018, the number dropped again to 25, and then in 2019 remained pretty similar, around 27 that were involved in non-fatal shootings. So I know that number may not look, number may not be going down in 2020 for numerous reasons, but it's important for us to share this data that this approach has been working and helping to stop shootings in Minneapolis. And then this graph just shows the results that I just spoke about. I see there might be some questions in the chat. Does it make sense to pause for them right now, or are we good to keep going?
We're good to keep going.
Okay.
There's comments on how cool a program these are.
Oh, great. Okay, I can't see the chat, so awesome. Okay. April, go ahead.
Actually, there is one question that just came up. Erin, could you talk a little about how the GBI interventions work?
Sure. So basically, the city, we partner with law enforcement to come up with a list of individuals, basically, who this formula is basically driven from John Jay College. So they've worked with many other cities across the nation to kind of come up with a standardized procedure to come up with a list of individuals who are most likely to be next to perpetrate violence. So maybe someone who's most likely to be the next shooter, or the person who's most likely next to be shot. And oftentimes those are group members. And so through a partnership with law enforcement and with probation and the community, there is a process called a call-in, where these individuals are called in, and they are spoken to by the mayor, by the chief of police, by sometimes the county attorney, sometimes the federal attorneys are available. And then also they hear from credible community members. So there's a group called the Moral Voice Group. So they hear from people who have been members of gangs and have had, like, they talk about their experience and how it impacted their life. They hear from someone who has lost a family member due to group or gang violence. And then they hear from one of our social service providers at the end, who talk about what they can do to help them. And the idea is sort of to like put some pressure on the members through like law enforcement pressure, but also just to really say, we're here for you anytime if you need help, if you want to, make a change. And so that's sort of the nuts and bolts of the strategy. And then everyone we haven't been able to do this with COVID, but everyone sits down and then shares a meal together. And I know April and myself have both been in attendance of many of the call-ins, and it's really powerful. And then we have our credible messengers who are basically available 24/7 to answer calls. They'll go pick people up if they are in a situation where they're fearful that they might become involved in some sort of violent situation, and help get them to safety. They help them getting jobs. They help them with their family. They get them connected to resources, whatever they need to like get out of that life. And so, April, do you want to add anything about GBI?
I would just say that during those call-in meetings, there's also sort of like on the law enforcement side, there's sort of this message that's like, we know who you are. We have your information, and we're watching. So whoever decides they're gonna, engage in gun violence first is going to have like the full weight of law enforcement come down upon them, and not just on that one person, but on the group. So there's some additional sort of pressure to say, you're already on our radar, and we're here to try to offer you an alternative. In some cases, we've even helped people relocate. So take advantage of these resources, and also use your capital within your group to not engage in violence, because if you do, you're all going to have repercussions, even if you're not the one that's the actual individual that shoots or engages in that violence. So that I just want to give a little bit of extra context.
Thank you.
All right, moving on to our most recent sort of initiative, the violence interrupters outreach workers that have been out in the community just recently. So even though we've used outreach in other ways in the past, this is the first time we've really lifted it up, specifically connected directly to the OVP, or the Office of Violence Prevention. So the idea is that we use these trusted community members, kind of similar to what I was saying before, people that have had real lived experience, and that have relationships already in the community, to focus on neighborhood specific areas. They detect any potentially violent situations and then use informal mediation, non-physical conflict resolution, and interruption expertise to de-escalate. The pilot phase was launched just this past summer in South and North Minneapolis. And it's intended to be timely, visible, positive, and peaceful in the communities to face some of the immediate concerns around violence. Although this was just a pilot, we intend to generate some information and insights to what our longer term, broader implementation will look like. And as part of that, we've engaged some expert technical assistance, community partners, and we're working to design a longer term monitoring and evaluation strategy. So this kind of a program and approach is actually not new to it's new to Minneapolis, but it's not new to this country. There's a couple different organizations that have been engaging in violence interruption outreach. Two that I could speak to is Cure Violence. And actually, I don't remember what the other one is called right now, but definitely there's some in Chicago and as well as Oakland.
April, two quick questions, if this is a good pausing point. Is that okay?
Sure.
So the first question, in this pilot program in Minneapolis, what was the scope of the program? For example, how many outreach workers were there? And then does the city assume liability for the outreach workers? Are they employees of the city? How does that employment work?
I'm not completely clear on the second one, although I think that's a really important question, and I know somebody else on my team might be more clear on it, but probably not me.
I can answer the second part,
Okay.
April, if you can answer the first part.
I don't know the exact number, but I think it was about 25, split between those two teams on the north side and the south side.
Yeah, and they were focused primarily on portion of the Lake Street corridor in South Minneapolis, and then also around 38th in Chicago near the George Floyd Memorial, and then also in Cedar Riverside. And then the north side, there was a Broadway corridor group as well. And then they also did end up doing some outreach downtown based on just like requests from different groups, depending on what was going on. As far as the second question, they are not employees of the city. They are contracted through different neighborhood associations. So for instance, like the Corcoran Neighborhood Association was one of those groups this year. They receive funding from the city. They have a contract with the city, and then they pay the outreach workers, so the liability is covered through that way. So Jenna, sorry, I realize we're kind of going over time, so I can try to just get through the last few slides here. The next two initiatives that we were going to talk about are our Blueprint Approved Institute. This was under our primary prevention bucket. This is one of my main bodies of work that I'm responsible for in the office. And it's we call it our Blueprint Approved Institute because the name calls back to our city strategic plan, which is the blueprint to prevent youth violence. And we support grassroots organizations. So these are really small organizations, sometimes just individuals who are doing like boots on the ground, really good violence prevention work, but maybe haven't like formalized their organization. They may not have ever had any sort of funding or like governmental funding. A lot of times they're just doing this work and sort of not even being able to pay themselves for it. And so we work with these really small organizations to help them build their organizational capacity. So they receive funding from the city, and part of that funding they are able to use for their own capacity building. that could look at things like hiring a graphic designer to help them with their social media presence or creating a website. It could mean them getting specific training that's relevant to their work. And then they also receive funding to do a violence prevention program. And then they also attend some professional development seminars where they're learning about skills, building on their own skills around grant writing, budgeting, doing program evaluation. And the idea then is that they're then able to put that into use and go on to secure additional sources of funding and sort of continue to do their good work beyond their participation in this cohort. And I will say we have formed some really amazing partnerships through this program. We've gone on to work with a lot of these individuals on some of our bigger initiatives that we just talked about, like GVI. And so it's a really valuable program in the city. It's, I have a soft spot for it. And we actually have a request for applications open right now where we're looking for new organizations to start in 2021. So if anyone here is familiar with a small organization or individual that might be a good fit, please let me know. I'd be happy to share the RFA with them. And then the last thing, I'll just quickly kind of go through this, is our Office of Violence Prevention Fund. This is newer to our body of work. We receive, in 2019, we received $325,000 from the city to put back into community-based organizations to do community-led strategies around violence prevention. So like community building, arts and activations, training youth, street outreach, doing trauma awareness, community meals, resource referrals, etc. So on the right here, you can see the funding that we received, some of the outputs that came from that funding. And then in 2020, we received $250,000 that we had then again put out into the community through a request for proposal process. And these are the 14 organizations that were funded in 2020. Just wanted to let you all see them. Again, we'll be putting out a request for proposals again in the next, hopefully, coming weeks. And grateful again that the city is continuing to fund this work, and we'll be able to have a new set of organizations that we're funding. And sorry to feel rushing, but I just want to make sure you all have time for your group discussion. Real quickly, just want to talk about sort of the future of our Office of Violence Prevention. So in 2021, in our budget, we received $1.73 million for ongoing funding for the expansion of the Office of Violence Prevention. So that looks like expanding some of our current programs. So for instance, April mentioned Next Step. We're looking to expand that to Abbott in the coming year. And it's also going to allow us to do some new programming with more of a formalized focus around trauma and healing. And April is doing a lot of that trauma work that maybe she can mention. I know we're sort of short on time. And also we'll be doing some specific work around de-escalation training and also restorative justice. Another big change is that the positions of the civilian positions that are called community navigators they're newer positions within the last couple of years. They were part of the Minneapolis Police Department, and they're now moving in under our office. And they provide culturally and community specific outreach. So they're actually able to respond to cases and help connect people who are impacted by violence and get them connected to resources. And those will be city employees. And then finally, we're going to be adding some additional staff members to our office. So we've been a team of 5 or 6 of us for a real long time, and we're happy that we're going to be expanding and getting some new coworkers this year, including we're going to be getting someone to focus specifically on research and evaluation, so we can really do more robust evaluation around our programs, so that when we talk to residents, we can show you how our work is making an impact. And then we'll also be like expanding some positions around like focusing on domestic violence, for instance. We do have a position open right now to oversee our gun and group violence prevention work. So working on things like Next Step and GVI. So again, if you know someone who's interested, send them our way so that they can apply. And then lastly, just want to touch real briefly on the transforming community safety engagement process. That work is now falling under our office and being head up by one of our colleagues, Jen White. And the goals of this process. So I'm sure many of you are aware that the City Council passed a resolution to embark upon a 1-year community engagement process to hear from residents about what community safety looks like and how we want to transform that going forward. So it's looking at things like alternatives to policing, more public health oriented violence prevention initiatives like those we've talked about tonight, and then other policy reforms and continuing to shift police culture. So that work is happening. There is a website here where I put read more. You can go on and read more. I think Jenna, you're welcome to share this presentation with your group members tonight, but you can read more about that work. There's currently a survey open where you can give your feedback to these different areas. So we'd love to have you fill out. And then just wanted to also call out that that we'll be giving an update to the City Council on January 21st at 1:30 p.m. And there's a link to where you can watch that. The meetings are all recorded, so you can also watch it later on YouTube. But just kind of wanted to let you know, there's going to be some opportunities coming in the very near future for like meeting with focus groups. So this group that you all are a part of might be a great fit for meeting with and giving feedback throughout this process. So just wanted to make sure it was on your radar if it wasn't already. That's all I had. The last slide here just has a link to our Office of Violence Prevention website. April, do you have anything to add?
No, I think, you know, we can go into answering some of the questions. I don't know exactly how the next step of this meeting works, but I see there's several.
Yeah, I can start reading them in the order that they came in. So the first question is from Kathy, just commenting on the importance of schools in violence prevention and training student leaders. Could you comment on how you connect with schools and, for example, train student leaders or do something of that sort?
That's a great question. So I mentioned earlier that the program that I'm doing, Coaching Boys to Men, is in direct connection with the athletics on the north side. We did actually offer the training to coaches at any high school. I just wasn't able to provide the secondary sort of support for this facilitation of the lessons. But thus far, I haven't had any coaches take me up on that offer in others other than Cooper, Robbinsdale Cooper. Which wasn't initially a high school that we identified. In addition to that, as part of that work, I've worked with Jenna and some of the other school-based clinics, which is also housed out of the health department, to do some consent assemblies. So these were grade level assemblies where we talked specifically about consent. And as part of that, we engaged a group of youth or student leaders, specifically at Patrick Henry High School, who helped co-facilitate that conversation for those grade level consent assemblies. I would say in addition to that, when I spoke about the YCB outreach team, which is also connected to this 5-year CDC funded initiative around teen dating violence and youth violence prevention, they've had contracts in several of the schools in the past, which was, you know, really the school's decision to do so. But they oftentimes will actually be in the schools during passing time and during the lunch hours to help prevent violence while in school. They also, as part of the CDC grant, will show up at extracurricular events like football and basketball games, fairs, other community events that happen up and down the public corridors. And they also will show up after school at the bus stops and sometimes ride the bus with students to try to make sure that they have the supports there to prevent violence. So those are some of the things that come directly to my mind. One thing I'm working on right now, which is really just getting started, and I don't have a lot of additional information on it, was an additional piece of funding that the CDC offered to their partners in 5 or 6 different states that have been part of this cohort, doing teen dating violence and youth violence prevention, which focuses on the intersections of racism and violence. And so we partnered with the YMCA to engage a group of young people that are actually involved in their programs that are often connected to the juvenile justice system and other, I would say, government systems. And through that, they're going to receive a training that they give through the YMCA that focuses on equity. And I'm going to supplement that with an additional training on trauma. And my hope is that through this work, they'll come up with a campaign to engage more young people around the intersections of race and violence prevention. And also, my hope is that we can start to develop our own sort of youth advisory council for the Office of Violence Prevention. In the past, we've partnered a lot with the YCB. They also have something called the Minneapolis Youth Congress, which is made up of students from Minneapolis public schools. So we have had youth involvement, but we haven't had our own council, but that's something that we're hoping to work on in the coming year.
Awesome, thank you. So the next.
Oh, I had one other thing that I forgot I was going to mention. We also have a monthly multi-jurisdictional meeting, which means that we partner with multiple different people from the county, from Minneapolis public schools, and share both updates and strategize sometimes on upcoming events where we think that we should be aware that there could be a lot of youth present, and we want to be there and be a presence for them and a support for them to prevent violence. So we've done that repeatedly for the St. Patrick's Day celebrations downtown, and also like if there's like an organized march by students or something like that, we'll make sure that they have some caring adults present to help make sure that those demonstrations go smoothly. So there is some collaboration, but not a formal youth advisory council at this time.